let's just move back to thinking about AI right now. You talked about that 0.1% privilege, right? And we've always been talking about world has disparity of wealth, but it always existed. Humans never had this concept of it's almost like physics. It's always going to be true. So while we increased the base poverty limits and we got more people to kind of be okay, the disparities only increased because the total amount of wealth in the world had dramatically and exponentially grown since Industrial Revolution, right? AI, I feel, is going to be making that. You remember that chart how the GDP of the world has gone like this?
Yeah.
I think it's going to go to levels we cannot imagine now, right? And at a much faster acceleration rate, which means the disparity of what we have felt so far is going to look like a joke now, because the richest set of 500 human beings are going to be at a different order of magnitude of wealth and power, right? Now the question is that if this is going to happen, and we always had this conflict of disparity and all of that, what happens to the concept of nations? What happens to the concept of conflicts? How do poor nations survive? How do rich nations benefit? How do you see this evolve?
Any answer to that is going to be extremely dark. But again, we can play that Sherlockian game of logical reasoning and deduction. When we speak of nations and borders and GDP, these are all brand new concepts, just a few decades really.
Yes.
And before that, there was no codification of GDP.
Yes.
And the geographical maps looked completely, absolutely different.
Yeah.
So I think it's even meaningless to talk about these concepts that have lasted barely a century.
Yes.
And if you look back and peek back in history, maybe even 3,000 years ago, if you pick, let's say, Carthage, that civilization that, I don't know, for some reason the entire world has forgotten, but Carthage lasted, 700, 800 years, and it was one of the most powerful civilizations on the planet. And within that civilization, there were periods, mini eons of dictatorships, aristocracy, republic, democracy. Same thing in ancient Greece, same thing in ancient India. All kinds of kingdoms have gone through all kinds of cycles.
Yeah.
So when we speak of today's world, geography, etc., we are ignoring 3 to 5,000 years worth of recorded history, and these things having been played out countless times. In ancient Greece, there was a period where you had 50 years of democracy, 50 years of republic, suddenly became a dictatorship, and suddenly something else. When we peek back, it's just a distant blur.
Yeah.
But our present right now, it's only just a few decades, right? So how can we it's meaningless. It's meaningless to project these, what could be temporary things. GDP lasted, the idea of GDP was formulated in the 30s, just barely a century, into the future. The concept might disappear 10 years from now. That's how humanity has always.
Concept of money, concept of country,
possible.
all of what is
we could keep redefining. Who knows, right? So it's very delusional of us to root our entire idea of future in the last 60 years. We really have to read history.
Well, that's a very pertinent topic. Most people have not really read history, except what came in their academics, which have been obviously influenced through what the country wanted you to know. If you really go to history and see patterns of it, so you talk about civilizations. There's an interesting study and books and YouTube and documentary for how civilizations end, right?
Oh yeah.
And I've always I between two companies I had come up with Delta 4 as a concept, and it was actually born out of physics and biology on how a species wipes off another species, and basically the key insight is the new version is significantly more efficient at managing energy, which means keeping their entropy, local entropy low and overall increase entropy. For example, air conditions is keeping our local entropy low, right? We are not in rain struggling, and increasing the external entropy by passing on this heat and dissipating it further. Now, if you take this concept further, countries are nothing but these complexities again. Species are these complexities. So we call it the entropic complexities, which is just nothing but storage of energies going from one structure to another structure. So the study which is all studies point to one thing, that civilizations are nothing but a store of energy, which dissipates into the next store of energy basis their ability to be more efficient at doing things, right? And therefore we are going through this interesting transitionary thing where the the ability to create delta 4 is now a lot more easier than what it took, the amount of energy it required. So therefore, a lot of people make this joke about, can you make, actually I'm going to ask you that question. Can you make an LLM for, I'm going to give you $100 million? Can you do that?
So that, that reminds me of this very famous quote from Carl Sagan. So in his, I think one of the episodes of Cosmos, he said, to create an apple pie, to make an apple pie, you must first create the universe from scratch. And that is a legendary, absolutely mind-blowing quote. What that really means is that nothing really exists in isolation. So like we discussed earlier, today's AI, the transformer breakthrough of the 2017 or the LLM GPT breakthroughs of the last 2 years, etc., couldn't have spontaneously emerged. You've had to have the entire civilizational progress, etc., that have led to that moment, including actual work, research, etc. So if you ask me, can firstly, I'm not an expert in LLMs or GPTs, but if you ask me, there's this X amount of money, can you create this really complex piece of technology out of nothing? The answer is no. So how can one create something like that out of thin air? You can't create it out of thin air. OpenAI used the research that came out of Google Brain Project to build this. Now, if Google hadn't published that paper, we most likely wouldn't have had these breakthroughs. We wouldn't be chatting about this. So that the thought that you can create something extraordinarily complex out of isolation, like one person or 10 people, is largely delusional, I would say. If there are people out there who think that I can, put X amounts of money here, let an LLM emerge, it won't. So it worked out for OpenAI because they had the right environment where, like we discussed again, there were decades worth of research, people, culture, DNA, access to material, access to technology, access to money. It's a series of events that have led to why was OpenAI founded? Even that is it's an event in the series. So sometimes it's possible to create things out of nothing. Like wartime, humanity changes. When there's, let's say, threat of war, people suspend their entire lives, come together, build extraordinary things. But that is that's an exceptionally rare event. That's not the norm. So in peacetime, if you say, I'll give you X, build Y, the likelihood is really, 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 really low.